Hi again, and welcome to our second lecture on season 1 of Bojack. In this lecture, I'm going to take up a quite different topic than I did the first lecture. I want to look in particular at apology and forgiveness. And I want to think a little bit about the role of both apology and forgiveness in our social lives and in our moral lives. So I want to ask questions like, when should we apologize? What makes something a good apology or even a real apology? If somebody does give a good apology, is that person owed forgiveness, or is forgiveness optional? I also want to ask questions like, why do we even seek forgiveness in the first place? What does forgiveness do for us, and why do we want it? And likewise, why do people want apologies? Since apologies and forgivenesses are mostly things that happen in words, how do they help us, right? They don't, in and of themselves, change our situation in life, it would seem. So why are they so important to us? I also want to ask what the difference is between a private apology and a public apology and how they might function differently from one another. All of these themes come up in season 1 very vividly, and then they're going to come up again later on in the show, like almost everything does. I've assigned as one of your readings Alice McLaughlin's paper on public apology. And here she goes over what she sees as some of the essential elements of apology more generally. Right? So one question we need to ask that she's asking is, quite aside from or before we get to the question of why we want apologies, when we owe apologies, what makes for a good apology, we might also just ask, what is an apology? What kind of a thing that we're doing with speech is an apology? She names a bunch of conditions for what she thinks an apology requires in order for it to even count as an apology. And these include things like acknowledging the specific harm that you did and that you're apologizing for, taking responsibility for that harm, and committing to not doing that harm in the future. So if you think about it, there are various things that people say that they might think are apologies or that are almost apologies, but that aren't really. Right? So if you say, I'm sorry I did that to you, it wasn't my fault, I was tricked, or it wasn't my fault, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, then you're not really apologizing because you're not actually taking responsibility for the harm. Right? Or if instead of actually apologizing, you just try to be nice to the person and make it clear that you're going to be nice to them from now on and try to smooth things over, that might be a good thing to do. But it's not the same as an apology. An apology requires an actual presentation and communication to the person of what you did, that you're responsible for what you did, why it was harmful, and that you're not going to do it in the future. McLaughlin also argues that public apologies, especially when they're done as a kind of a required ritual, like people will demand an apology and then somebody gets up and gives an apology because one has been requested, these are unlikely to function well as apologies. She doesn't think that it's impossible for public apologies to be good apologies, but it's very difficult for them to be good apologies, because when an apology is a public performance of that sort, it's very hard for it to also be taken as a genuine taking of responsibility for a harm and a commitment to not doing that harm in the future. So she thinks that often public apologies are more like social rituals that we go through in order to prove that we understand what's expected of us and in order to try to restore trust by making clear that you're playing by the rules, which is different from what a proper apology should do. Now, there are at least 2 major apologies in season 1, and both of these apologies arguably go very, very wrong indeed. In episode 2, we see Bojack being forced to publicly apologize to the Navy SEAL for stealing his muffins, or I shouldn't say stealing because that's up for grabs, but for taking his muffins. And he's forced, as part of this apology, to publicly perform his respect for the troops and his gratitude to the troops for their service. In episode 8, so that's a very public apology, right? It's on TV, and it's exactly the kind that McLaughlin is talking about, in the sense that it's very much demanded out of him very explicitly. In episode 8, we get almost the opposite kind of apology, right? It's a very private apology. He goes to apologize to his friend Herb Kazaz, who is dying, who he betrayed years ago. And this is nothing that Herb has requested that he do. It's nothing that anyone will know that he's done. It's extremely private, and it's very much under his own volition. So it's like the opposite kind of an apology. And an interesting question that I want you to think about is, we know why he did the first apology. Basically, he was forced to do the first public apology. Why did he want to do the second apology? What did he want to get out of going to visit Herb? And what sort of thing was he trying to accomplish with that apology? The first one is clearly just a performance. And interestingly, it actually gives him a platform to make clear exactly why he thinks that this kind of forced, ritualized apology is dumb. In fact, he uses his apology to the Navy SEAL to much more generally critique our whole tradition of going through various kinds of public speech rituals just because they're demanded of us and not because they have any kind of authentic purpose. So he thinks that in general, the way that we are forced to continuously say things like, yes, I support the troops, of course I support the troops, thank the troops, isn't particularly any kind of expression of a genuine feeling so much as it is a required public social ritual. Later on in the series, you'll see something very similar when they make jokes about the whole required ritual of saying thoughts and prayers after somebody gets shot. There's a lot of play with this idea of required social speech, public social speech, that is ritualized and not especially meaningful, but is expected out of us. So these little speech rituals, Bojack suggests, and Alice McLaughlin would agree, often replace any need to really grapple with the moral shape of real events or to really say things that are meaningful about the moral shape of a situation. It's kind of cute that this episode starts with him and the Navy SEAL having a fight over dibs. Because dibs, if you think about it, is another kind of ritualized social speech, right? We've made up this social ritual, and there's no reason why it should work that way. This is just a performance that we go through. So he's, in some sense, you could read the episode as equating the whole ritual of dibs, which is just a silly social ritual that we've made up, with the ritual of fake expressions of respect for the troops. They're being treated as both equally silly and arbitrary word rituals. So, in fact, what we get from Bojack, instead of a proper apology, is an extended riff on this kind of ritualized speech, and it's kind of awesome. But notice that even though he's very harsh here about people who go through bits of ritualized speech without particularly meaning it just because it's expected of them, he's not above doing it himself at other times, so it's complex. He doesn't really get to lord this over other people as much as he acts like he's doing, right? When he talks to Diane for the purposes of writing the book, he often slips into just handing her little rituals and cliches that are the kinds of things he thinks people are supposed to say about themselves. And in fact, when you see scenes from Horsing Around, it's kind of all those little social rituals, right? Every joke on that show seems to be some sort of little performance. And when the audience goes, "ah," or claps, they're clapping when they're supposed to clap, and they're saying "ah" when they're supposed to clap, when they're supposed to say "ah," because they know what is socially expected out of them as far as performances go. So he's not above participating in the kind of thing he's critiquing here. Let's move on to his second apology, the one he makes to Herb in episode 8. And Diane is with him again in this scene. And it's an interesting scene because he gets there, and after some awkwardness at the beginning, they start really enjoying each other's company. They start joking around, they start reminiscing about the past, they start being warm with one another, they start bonding. And Bojack makes the mistake of thinking that that means that he has successfully apologized. But of course he didn't. Having a good time with somebody and smoothing things over with somebody is not the same as actually going through the difficult act of saying, I take responsibility, I did this harm, I won't do it in the future, it's on me. And that's what's actually needed out of him. It's not just a matter of making nice. Eventually Diane gets him to see this, and he partly sees it on his own, and he does actually go and for real apologize to Herb. And it's one of these rare scenes for Bojack when there's nobody else around. It's just him and the person he's talking to. There's no public persona at stake. And his apology is actually, by Alice McLaughlin's standards, a very good one, right? It has all the elements an apology needs. You should actually go look at that scene again and watch it with that in mind. It has exactly what we want out of an apology, which, given what we know about Bojack, is kind of surprising that he did such a good job. And he finishes it and he gives an excellent and real apology. And Herb doesn't forgive him. And he's shocked. He thinks that if he gives a good apology, then he's owed forgiveness. That's what happens, right? You apologize, you get forgiveness out of it. So I want to get you to think about two issues there. One is, if Herb doesn't forgive him, does that mean it wasn't a successful apology? Does a successful apology have to be one that elicits forgiveness? Or do we want to say that an apology can be successful even if it doesn't result in forgiveness, right? That apology opens the door for forgiveness and invites forgiveness, but doesn't demand it or require it. And I actually think that's a better understanding of apology, though I understand why Bojack feels like he did everything right and now he's owed forgiveness. But forgiveness might just not be the kind of thing that you're owed ever. So that's one question. And then the other thing I want you to think about is, what good does the apology do if it doesn't get forgiveness? And maybe even what good does the apology do if it does get forgiveness? What's the use of apologies? One thing that I think is subtle and nice about that episode is that he's already made nice with Herb, right? Like I said before, they're already hanging out and having a good time and talking and reminiscing. So you might think that all of the social benefits of apology have already been gotten and that he got his friend back. So what extra morally is important about apologizing? And what extra socially is important about apologizing? What are we trying to get out of an apology? And what's the relationship between that and forgiveness? When Herb refuses to forgive him, he says to him, "I know you better than anyone, and you're not the good guy." It's interesting having this language because this language is going to be mirrored right back to him again in his, well, I shouldn't say mirrored back to him. He's going to mirror this speech back out again when he gives his big speech to Diane that we talked about in the last lecture, right? The one where he asks her to reaffirm for him and tell him that he's good on the inside. Right? He wants to know that somebody who knows him well thinks that he's the good guy. And this is hearkening directly back to the scene with Herb where Herb tells him, "I know you," right? Basically, I know who you are on the inside and you're not the good guy. This is Bojack's worst fear. His worst fear is that there is no good guy on the inside underneath all of his actions and his mistakes and so on, waiting to come out. As we discussed in the last lecture, he lives through his public persona. He finds his sense of self and meaning through how he is seen by others and through his fame, and yet he also, at the same time, because he's a very complicated character, really wants there to be a real self under that public persona. He doesn't want the public persona to be the whole thing. He wants to know that underneath it all, there's a real Bojack under there who's good. And Herb won't give it to him. And that's the ultimate refusal to give him forgiveness, I would say. Now notice, why does Bojack need the forgiveness so badly? Why doesn't he just feel satisfied that he gave the apology that he felt he really owed and he's ready to move on? If taking responsibility for yourself is really central to your sense of self, to your existential sense of your own worthwhileness and purpose, then you're going to want to apologize when you've done harm, right? Because taking responsibility for your actions is how you build a self. So if you're that kind of person, then regardless of whether you get forgiveness, apology is going to be important for you. But why is apology important for Bojack, right? Because as we've seen, and as I just discussed, Bojack's defining feature is that he judges himself and measures himself and lives through how others see him. So it makes sense that for him, if he doesn't get the forgiveness, then that undermines the whole point of apologizing, right? Again, if you really care most about taking responsibility for yourself and build yourself that way, then apologizing will be enough. But if what you need is the public recognition and uptake, the other person's recognition of who you are and that you're a good person, then the forgiveness is where you get the satisfaction from, right? Not the apologizing. And if you don't get the forgiveness, if you don't get that public feeding back to you that you're a good person, then the whole thing was pointless. And so he's incapable of finding value in his apology, even though it was a strikingly good apology, because he doesn't get forgiveness out of it. And you might wonder, another question to sort of think about is, why doesn't Herb forgive him? Is he just trying to punish Bojack and get his revenge for all those years where he feels like Bojack betrayed him and was a bad friend? Or is he just thinking, great, you apologized, but forgiveness is not a thing that I owe you, right? What's going on Herb's end when he makes the decision not to forgive? So in the end, Bojack doesn't get any closure, right? He goes there looking for closure, whatever closure means, which is an interesting question, and he doesn't get it. He doesn't get it any more than Diane got it when she went back to be with her family and her dad has died. So another interesting question is, what's closure, right? What is Diane trying to get out of going back to Boston when her dad dies? And what is Bojack trying to get out of this last meeting with Herb Kazaz? We talk about this a lot. I got to go see them one more time for closure. But what is closure? I'm not even going to try to answer that for you. I just want you to think on your own about what is it that Bojack and Diane are trying to find and get in those 2 episodes. Okay, we'll pause and we'll keep going in a second.